You're watching The Citizen Report, real, in-depth American.
Welcome to The Citizen Report. I'm John DeShannon. Thank you for joining me today. As always, this newscast is real, in-depth American. It's always good to be back here with you. Thank you so much for joining me. So it's been about 6 weeks since I last joined you, give or take, and a lot has happened in multiple areas of the geopolitical landscape, and what I want to do is not necessarily focus on a full summary of what's happened since I last joined you, but I want to focus on a couple of pointed things that I want to talk about here. Now, in future episodes, I hope to get more into other topics such as Iran and stuff like that. There's no shortage of high importance level type of stuff we could talk about, but I want to talk about a couple things today that may or may not be getting the attention that people should be looking, people should be looking at it more than they perhaps are. Particularly this first topic I'm going to talk about. It has to do with the mainstream media. Now, for those who aren't, fully aware, usually when I reference the mainstream media on this broadcast, I use the term Mockingbird. So I usually say something like mainstream Mockingbird media. Now, when I say that, I am referencing Operation Mockingbird. Now, Wikipedia, just to say, is not exactly a gold standard for absolute truth, right? But I'm going to go ahead and choose to use their language here and how they choose to define Operation Mockingbird. Now, the reason I'm bringing this up is going to play into what I'm going to talk about next. So, Operation Mockingbird, quoting Wikipedia here, is an alleged large-scale program of the United States Central Intelligence Agency, or the CIA, that began in the early years of the Cold War and attempted to manipulate domestic American news media organizations for propaganda purposes. According to author Deborah Davis, Operation Mockingbird recruited leading American journalists into a propaganda network and influenced the operations of front groups. CIA support of front groups was exposed when, in April 1967, Rampart's article reported that the National Student Association, or NSA, received funding from the CIA. In 1975, Church Committee congressional investigations revealed agency connections with journalists and civic groups. Now, that's a bit technical, what I just said. Let me just kind of rephrase what this all is. Basically, the mainstream media, when you watch ABC, CBS, NBC, it is all a front, basically, for the, perpetuating, if you'd like, narratives that certain people want portrayed in the media so that the populace buys into it. Now, I don't think I have to tell you, the mainstream Mockingbird media is not exactly as ironclad in their reputation these days. In fact, CBS is about just right down the toilet in their reputation at this point because, among other things, they brought in recently Barry Weiss, who had no experience running a network-level news organization, and basically she's kind of blowing the place up. And, perhaps you've heard about this, recently fired former CBS Evening News and was, until his firing, a regular contributor, to 60 Minutes, Scott Pelley. And Scott Pelley was voicing his opposition to basically, to paraphrase what he said, killing 60 Minutes. Now, regardless of what you think about Scott Pelley and CBS and how they're operating these days, that's kind of beside the point. I don't pretend to know everything that's going on at CBS and some of these other networks, right? But I think it's, when you look at what's going on, it's pretty nefarious what is happening not just from the standpoint of, now what is so obviously an open spectacle, if you'd like, of, influencing and shaping narratives for public consumption. But to be honest with you, many people on the left claim that this is, the Trump administration. They're trying to influence, CBS. They're basically, through putting their thumb on the scale with, alleging conditions being met, being set for, the recent Paramount Skydance merger and the forthcoming Paramount and I believe Warner Brothers Discovery merger. If I remember correctly on the latter one. But the reality is, this has been going on for decades. This whole operation to influence the public to think certain things and to believe certain things, it's been going on since Walter Cronkite. I hate to tell you folks, but back in the day when, people say, oh, I miss the good old days, you turn on the, at 6:30 or depending on your time zone, 5:30, and you turn on CBS Evening News with Walter Cronkite and how he's, just giving you the facts and nothing but the facts. Folks, back then, it was all propaganda also. You think it's only gotten bad now. It was bad then. The only difference is now it is so openly, flagrantly obvious that there are, factions of the deep state trying, they're putting their thumb on the scale, and it's very clear, it's clearly obvious that these networks, sorry to say this, the news divisions exist expressly to, shape narratives. What is good journalism, by the way? Just my Jonathan Shannon definition of it. It is, you present the facts as best as you know them to be, and you make clear any biases and where you're presenting it from. In other words, if you're presenting facts, you do so as honestly and forthrightly as possible, and you make clear where you stand. It doesn't mean you turn it all into an editorial, but you basically, what you do is that you say, this is what I believe is the truth, and you employ good journalism to find out the facts. You don't just, spout opinions. You carefully research as best as you can, and you present facts as best as you know them to be. And then if you're a Christian, if you are a conservative, in my opinion, you should disclose that. Because honestly, and I remember doing an interview a few years ago, and the person I had on at the time said very well that, basically, to paraphrase as I recall, even those that claim to don't have a bias, you have a bias. So, the idea that, these news organizations are not biased is absolutely dishonest. And in fact, if I can just digress for a second here, whenever you have a news organization claiming to just present the facts, and I get it, producers and stuff, they come up with promos, they cut promos for TV, 30 second, 60 second, 15 second, what have you, and they want to come up with these little zingers to reel you in, as it were, to watch their news program, or go to their website or whatever. And they say, we give you just the facts, and we leave this, there's no spin here, and there's no opinion here. That is so dishonest. I'm sorry. Now, there may be those that genuinely believe that they're just giving you the facts without a bias, but believe me, you have a bias. And it may be something like just simply being an American. For example, not wanting to bring in Sharia law. When you are a war correspondent, or you're, a reporter, let's just, say, and you are, for example, you're overseas and you're reporting on the brutalities of, just one thought comes to mind, the current regime in Syria. How they are, treating, at least as best as I can, as best as I know it to be anyway, they're not treating Christians well there. And the brutality of it all. And then you have, the ongoing situation in Ukraine and Russia. Are you going to say that war is a good thing? So right then and there, you have a bias, because you have a bias that's not in favor of war or brutality, for example. I digress, like I said. But what I want to talk about, this is kind of laying the foundation, I think, for what I want to discuss today. And this has to do with the media. And I have a little bit of a passion for this because, granted, when I was a little bit younger, I was wrestling with whether or not I would go into, working in TV news. And I thought, even when I was young, it was not likely I was going to be able to get away with seeing what was so obviously deep state control, not presenting news, but is presenting propaganda. Because there's a difference between presenting news and making clear what your biases are. There's nothing wrong with saying what your biases are. Where it becomes a problem is when you claim something is news. What you're really doing, though, is manipulating facts to favor your stance. That is propaganda. Or just, in some cases, fabricating things altogether. But what I want to discuss is this. I believe I have discussed this in the past, but it's just more or less for review's sake. This is from the website for U.S. Agency for Global Media. Now, in 2013, of course, under Obama, Trader 44, his administration was in place when they passed the law having to do with basically, allowing propaganda domestically. And so, let me put this up on screen. And I'm just going to read what this says. So, facts about the Smith-Mundt modernization. So, the U.S. Agency for Global Media and the media organizations that support it can now make their content available in broadcast quality upon request within the United States. This is due to a law that went into effect on July 2, 2013, amending the U.S. Information and Educational Exchange Act of 1948, known as the Smith-Mundt Act. Amending Smith-Mundt for this purpose was part of the strategic plan adopted in 2011 by the governing board overseeing the then BBG. And, next sentence has to do with this being basically a bipartisan, thing that was done, essentially, for all intents and purposes. But the reason I'm even bringing this up is that I want to remind my audience that they're literally telling you that agencies that are responsible for what was formerly, at least, the public-facing side of it, basically creating news content at the behest of the U.S. government for foreign consumption only. The Smith-Mundt Act, the modernization, as they put it, basically removed the prohibition of it being, targeting domestically. So what all this is to say then is now you have a situation where, you have propaganda that is officially legal in this country. I don't know if people fully understand that or not. It is legal to do propaganda in this country. So when you watch NBC, and I get it, this has more to do with, I believe this is like, in the purview, we'll say, of the Voice of America and things like that. But when you watch NBC, CBS, NBC, Fox, CNN, whatever else, right? MS Now and, the rest, you are not getting honest information. You're getting propaganda that is under, if you will, is being perpetuated at the behest of the deep state, which wants to push, among other things, globalism. So, anti-sovereignty. They don't want you wanting to be patriotic. If you've noticed, they've been slowly chipping away at the patriotism. Of course, right now we have America 250. So it, except for the, I guess, hard leftists, generally speaking, people are on board with that. But or at least they're, not against it, I guess. But basically, propaganda, as I said, is legal. And when you watch the media, you're not getting an honest news product, basically. So that leads me to my next topic in the media side of things. So NBC News, I know I'm citing the mainstream Mockingbird media, but it is what it is. Their article with the headline says as follows. FCC takes aim at Disney's push for public support amid regulatory probes. ABC stations aired spots urging viewers to contact the FCC and support the network in its fight against the agency, saying its actions threaten free speech. Let's go ahead and scroll down here, and that's a picture of the FCC Commissioner Brendan Carr. So the Federal Communications Commission on Monday blasted Disney's push for public support amid the agency's probes of The View and ABC's broadcast licenses, the latest development in Disney's growing standoff with regulators. The FCC under Trump-appointed chair Brendan Carr said in February that it was looking into whether The View violated equal time rules after an appearance by James Tellerico, the Democratic candidate in November's U.S. Senate race in Texas. The View, which first aired in 1997, is co-hosted by a panel of women who interview politicians and celebrities. Seeking to rally support from viewers, ABC launched a campaign Monday urging people to push back against what it says are threats to free speech. So, a couple of things on that. So, and actually I meant to read one other part. So, let me go back to the article for a second. It says further down, addressing ABC's new campaign, an FCC spokesperson said in a statement Monday, quote, Disney wants the FCC to classify The View as a bona fide news program, and it has chosen to run a campaign of misinformation to make its case misleading viewers about the law. That is a choice, unquote. Now, what I find interesting about that is, I must say, I do agree with that one sentence from the FCC. I'm not saying I'm completely supporting the current FCC and all of its decisions, but I do agree that they mention the fact that The View is deemed as, by Disney, which owns ABC, as a bona fide news program. That is, that is a fact. And I say that because a few years ago, The View, I believe, went from being ABC Daytime, I believe it's called. It may or may not be called Daytime, but basically the division of ABC dealing with general programming in the daytime, right? It transferred from that to be under the umbrella of ABC News. So that therefore makes The View, technically speaking, by definition, a news program. Not obviously a straight news program, where you just at least purport to present just news, but it is under that umbrella of the news division. So that brings it into a different type of ball game, if you will, for how it should operate if done properly. Now, I'm not pretending to be an expert of The View, but for instance, they have basically one conservative on there as a co-host, and then the rest are, whether they are intentionally so or not, they are on the left side, or they're not conservative at least. And basically, by perception of it, I mean, it should not be difficult to see how The View has gotten into a lot of issues lately, because they basically, they have your, if I can be, blunt here, your token conservative, right? You have one person say, oh, we're fair, we have one person here. And then everyone else is, left of center. And then, kind of on the flip side, you have on Fox News, which is not broadcast, it's on cable. You have the Five, which is like all conservative, or at least, basically you have one leftist, one left of center, and then the rest are whatever they are. But basically, ABC is starting up these promos to take on what it claims are FCC interferences. And FCC, by the way, is basically Now, requiring the ABC to go through license renewals for some of its ABC owned and operated stations early, as I understand it, instead of, I believe it's 2028 if it happened in the ordinary course of time. I just want to, for the record, play this promo and then we'll continue. This is from ABC. On, I don't know exactly, I believe this aired on Channel 7 ABC in New York City, which, of course, ABC owns.
New Yorkers, use your voice. No one supports your community like ABC7, sharing your stories, bringing us together. Channel 7 has proudly served you for more than 75 years. Every day, we commit to inform, entertain, and serve you. Now, the FCC is questioning our commitment to the community. Show your support for WABC TV by scanning this QR code today. You have until July 29th to tell the FCC to keep your trusted local station on the air.
So that is what ABC is now perpetuating. And I just find it really interesting. You know what's so ironic about this is some of these same entities were totally fine with open censorship of people that were not left of center. You know, and now suddenly it's like if they are being scrutinized, that's a problem. But if big tech is censoring people, stifling free speech on, you know, certain social media platforms, or, you know, like in, you know, YouTube or whatever, then it's totally fine. You know, because they say we got to control, you know, misinformation, as they say. Well, now, but it's a problem though if the FCC says, oh, let's take a look at your practices, ABC. And by the way, when I was younger, when I was in college, my opinion about this has evolved considerably. I used to believe, and I used to be of the opinion, and I used to be pretty much a libertarian on this point, that, you know, that the FCC should be, you know, much like a registry, right? Where they, you know, kind of keep the goalposts of who, you know, is allowed to operate a license. But as time goes on, it's becoming clear that the deep state, of course, this is well known, you know, for decades now, known now for that it's been going on for decades. The deep state controls these networks. And so, you know, what are we going to do? We're going to allow these networks to perpetuate anti-American content. And they're very clever about it, by the way. They're not in your face saying we hate America. And I'm not saying that people that work at these networks hate America, but I'm saying that the interests that control them certainly are not, in my view, entirely pro-America, and, you know, promoting, in the best interest of this country, let's say. So there used to be, by the way, what was called the Fairness Doctrine from the FCC. Basically, it traces its sources or its origins to earlier times, but basically the Fairness Doctrine existed from 1949 to about 1987, thereabout. Some aspects of it endured longer, but basically from 1949, the core of it from 1949 to 1987, the Fairness Doctrine basically was a policy, if you will, the FCC had, that networks, you know, stations, you know, must basically, you know, serve in the public interest. And basically that's to say they weren't allowed to have one side, you know, without the other, basically. And so and I think a lot of what's been going on lately is the media is being exposed for giving more airtime to Democrat and, you know, left-leaning interests, and not giving the same equal airtime to, you know, to the opposing side. So that is where it creates a problem. So the Fairness Doctrine, while not in place, did exist at one time, that basically bound TV stations and radio stations to, as this one article puts it, let me put it up on screen actually, to give reasonable opportunity for the discussion of conflicting views on issues of public importance. So that's from brookspierce.com, by the way. The FCC in 1987 ruled that the doctrine violated the First Amendment and did not serve the public interest because, one, discouraged broadcasters from covering controversial issues of public importance, two, lessened the flow of diverse viewpoints to the public, and three, it was unnecessary due to technological developments, including the growth in the number of radio and television stations and the expansion of cable television. So, basically, and this is a very interesting thing it says right here, by the way, with the rise of conservative talk radio in the 1990s, a small group on the political left began to clamor for a re-examination of that decision. The clamoring increased considerably during the 2008 presidential election, especially as Democrats gained control of Congress and the White House. So, there are certainly opposing, differing views on all this. But I find it very interesting that that we're now in a situation where the FCC is calling into question ABC and its practices and whether it's serving in the public interest. And that's really the litmus test, isn't it? Is whether these networks serve the public interest. By the way, these networks, if you watch at 6:30 p.m. Eastern or 5:30 Central, the evening news. Next time you watch ABC World News Tonight, CBS Evening News, NBC Nightly News, watch the commercial breaks and take note of how many of those commercials have to do with pharmaceuticals. And then think about the coverage that these programs and the networks at large, how they frame pharmaceutical-related articles. I can tell you as a matter of fact that they have demonized ivermectin, hydroxychloroquine for, let's say a certain, regimen. And they say, oh, you can't use that. That's just bogus. You can't, there's no evidence. There's no scientific evidence that it can be used for, C19, for example. Well, here in Tennessee, you can now get ivermectin at the pharmacy level, but you will have to pay out of pocket most likely because insurances do not like to cover it for C19 related things. Let's just put it that way. So, but these networks have a huge problem when it comes to impartiality. And I just find it so rich that all of a sudden they suddenly care about not having the government interfere when, if you'll recall, back in the Obama administration, you had literally people, listen to me now, you had literally people running ABC, I believe the ABC president was in some way related to an Obama official. Okay? Now you tell me if that makes sense. Does that sound coincidental? And then you have, other reporters and, various people, and they, people have done, you can go online and look this stuff up, where it was just all a rap sheet really of, connections between this person to someone in the Obama administration. But now all of a sudden these networks care a lot about government interference. Yeah, that really makes a lot of sense. That really sounds like an intellectually honest grievance there. So I just find it interesting that all this is happening and playing out right now. And, I think it's interesting too that Trump, by the way, this is going back a few months ago, that he threw his support behind Nexstar Media Group purchasing Tegna, which are two local station owner groups. They own a whole list of TV stations, and Nexstar owns networks, and they own most of CW now, and they own and operate News Nation, which was formerly WGN America. And this is what CBS News said, which I thought was interesting too. Let me pull this up for you. This is a February article, and this is what it says. Trump throws support behind Nexstar Tegna broadcast deal he once opposed. President Trump reversed course on Saturday and appeared to endorse Nexstar Media Group's $6.2 billion purchase of its rival Tegna. Quote, "We need more competition against the enemy, the fake news national TV networks," unquote, the president said in a post on Truth Social, adding that good deals like Nexstar's purchase of Tegna will help knock out the fake news because there will be more competition. So now I just want to remind my audience that not all is what it seems to be, because on the surface you can look at this and see it's a merger and therefore he says there's more competition. I would say it's less because for example, here in East Tennessee where I live, you have Channel 6 WATE, which is owned by Nexstar, and you have Channel 10 WBIR owned by Tegna. And so when you have two stations in town commonly owned, that can create a bit of an issue from whether or not you will really maintain independence of the two, from an editorial side of things. But I've heard differing things about that also, and I'm not saying I pretend to know how that all works, but I just find it so very interesting that we're seeing this uprising, as it were, of basically a call to accountability with these networks for how they've covered things over the years with ABC, CBS, and NBC particularly. And so when I mention Operation Mockingbird, that is by no coincidence to how you see things operate today. Now, it's an alleged operation. I don't think it's an allegation. I think you can look at the fruit of the tree and see very clearly these networks do not operate in a editorially independent, intellectually honest viewpoint. And so, like I said, I don't pretend to know everything there is to know about this, but from my vantage point, I see on the one hand, ABC, how they basically are saying this is government interference, when in reality they've been calling for censorship, or not necessarily calling, may be a strong word, but basically where they have perpetuated saying that it's fake news, yet that there's no proof that the COVID, well, I shouldn't have used that word, but the jibby jabber, let's put it that way, that there's no proof whatsoever that it causes potentially issues or harm, even though there was a huge surge in, among other things, myocarditis and athletes in their prime age and health dropping dead on the ground. And it's like, we're just supposed to believe now. And the media and these same networks come out with these reports saying, oh, there's an increase of young people dying, and it's, they're acting like it's actually a normal thing for teens and 20-something people to suddenly drop dead of a heart attack. When it used to be, you almost never heard of it. Sure, you had a case or two, but you almost never heard of it. And I just think that it's very interesting what is happening right now, and I do think we're on track. To be quite honest with you, with this, sort of this dealing with the deep state going on, and you can see this tug of war taking place. And I think, I don't pretend to know all the facts about Nexstar and Tegna. I don't like consolidation, and I certainly don't like elimination of editorial options in a given market. But on the other hand, as the president said, we, to quote him again, we need more competition against the enemy, putting enemy in all caps, the fake news national TV networks. So this is all a war. And I want people to understand that it's irregular war. It is information war. It is a war against the deep state. And there's going to be moves and counter moves. And not all moves appear to be necessarily a good thing on the surface. But as I remember, Julie, I think her name is Julie Green. She appears on His Glory TV. She's been very keen to say that things will not, things are not what they appear to be, basically. And I tend to agree with that. So when you're in a war posture against the deep state, certain things are being done that don't necessarily look good on the surface. And I understand a lot of people have concerns about various things, in different areas. I totally understand. I get that. And I don't pretend to know all the facts. And I'm not saying that everything is right with that. But just to be abundantly clear, I do not support consolidating TV station groups. In fact, let me just be abundantly clear here at the end by saying, generally speaking, I think that we should not even have station group owners that are allowed to own these huge swaths of TV stations all throughout the country. I think that there should be more community ownership. There should be more basically where local people, there's more of those people that are able to own stations. I don't know whether the economics of that are even viable, but I definitely do not support consolidation like this. But like I said, we are also in a war posture against the deep state, and certain things, things are not quite what they all seem to be. Whether this particular deal is directly in the scope of that or not, I don't know. I'm just simply telling you what my opinion is, and as best as I know the facts to be. So there was actually another topic I wanted to talk about, but I'm going to go ahead and just not do that because I've already been here for over 30 minutes today. Just a quick note here at the end. The website, thecitizenreport.net. That's where you can get the links for the Citizen Report, for getting the Rumble link, the YouTube link, the Facebook link. Go ahead and bookmark that if you would. That would be a good idea. And then just make sure you subscribe to me here on YouTube if you're watching me there, or on Rumble. And then give me a follow on Facebook on the Citizen Report page. Be much appreciated. You can follow me on X, formerly Twitter. Just search for my first and last name. You'll see my picture there, and you can just give me a follow there. And I don't post there regularly, but that's another way you can reach me as well. But on that note, God bless each and every one of you. Thank you so much for watching the Citizen Report, and I hope to see you again very soon here on the Citizen Report. And I hope you have a great rest of your day. And until next time, I'll see you again soon. Bye for now.